The Adventures of Danny Meadow Mouse by Thornton W Burgess, read by Bhavna Mishra for Browzly. Chapter 1. Danny Meadow Mouse is worried. Danny Meadow Mouse sat on his doorstep with his chin in his hands, and it was very plain to see that Danny had something on his mind. He had only a nod for Jimmy Skunk, and even Peter Rabbit could get no more than a grumpy "Good morning." It wasn't that he had been caught napping the day before by Reddy Fox and nearly made an end of. No, it wasn't that. Danny had learned his lesson, and Reddy would never catch him again. It wasn't that he was all alone, with no one to play with. Danny was rather glad that he was alone. The fact is, Danny Meadow Mouse was worried. Now, worry is one of the worst things in the world, and it didn't seem as if there was anything that Danny Meadow Mouse need worry about. But it is the easiest thing in the world to find something to worry over and make yourself uncomfortable about it. And when you make yourself uncomfortable, you are almost sure to make everyone around you equally uncomfortable. It was so with Danny Meadow Mouse. Striped Chipmunk had twice called him Crosspatch that morning, and Johnny Chuck, who had fought Reddy Fox for him the day before, had called him Grumpy. And what do you think was the matter with Danny Meadow Mouse? Why he was worrying? Because his tail was short. Yes, sir. That is all that ailed Danny Meadow Mouse that bright morning. Some people let their looks make them miserable. They worry about they're homely or freckled or short or tall or thin or stout, all of which is very foolish. And Danny Meadow Mouse was just as foolish in worrying because his tail was short. It is short. It certainly is all of that. Danny never had realized how short until he chanced to meet his cousin Whitefoot, who lives in the Green Forest. He was very elegantly dressed, but the most important thing about him was his long, slim, beautiful tail. Danny had at once become conscious of his own stubby little tail, and he had hardly had pride enough to hold his head up as became an honest Meadow Mouse. Ever since he had been thinking and wondering how his family came to have such short tails. Then he grew envious and began to wish and wish and wish that he could have a long tail like his cousin Whitefoot. He was so busy wishing that he had a long tail that he quite forgot to take care of the tail he did have, and he pretty nearly lost it, and his life with it. Old Whitetail, the marsh hawk, spied Danny sitting there, moping on his doorstep, and came sailing over the tops of the meadow grasses so softly that he all but caught Danny. If it hadn't been for one of the merry little breezes, Danny would have been caught, and all because he was envious. It's a bad, bad habit. Chapter 2. Danny Meadow Mouse and his short tail. All Danny Meadow Mouse could think about was his short tail. He was ashamed of it that whenever anyone passed, he crawled out of sight so that they should not see how short his tail was. Instead of playing in the sunshine as he used to do, he sat and sulked. Pretty soon his friends began to pass without stopping. Finally, one day, old Mr. Toad sat down in front of Danny and began to ask questions. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Old Toad. "Nothing," replied Danny Meadow Mouse. "I don't suppose there really is anything the matter, but what do you think is the matter?" said old Mr. Toad. Danny fidgeted, and old Mr. Toad looked up at jolly round red Mr. Sun and winked. "Sun is just as bright as ever, isn't it?" he inquired. "Yes," said Danny. "Got plenty to eat and drink, haven't you?" continued Mr. Toad. "Yes," said Danny. "Seems to me that it is a pretty good-looking suit of clothes you're wearing," said Mr. Toad, eyeing Danny critically. "Sunny weather, plenty to eat and drink, and good clothes. Must be you don't know when you're well off, Danny Meadow Mouse." Danny hung his head. Finally he looked up and caught a kindly twinkle in Mr. Toad's eyes. "Mr. Toad, how can I get a long tail like my cousin Whitefoot of the Green Forest?" he asked. "So that's what's the matter. Ha ha ha. Danny Meadow Mouse, I'm ashamed of you. I certainly am ashamed of you," said Mr. Toad. "What good would a long tail do to you? Tell me that." For a minute, Danny didn't know just what to say. I'd look so much better if I had a long tail, he ventured. Old Mr. Toad just laughed. "You never saw a Meadow Mouse with a long tail, did you? Of course not. What a sight it would be. Why, everybody on the Green Meadows would laugh themselves sick at the sight. You see, you need to be slim and trim and handsome to carry a long tail well. And then, what a nuisance it would be. You would always have to be thinking of your tail and taking care to keep it out of harm's way. Look at me, I'm homely. Some folks call me ugly to look at, but no one tries to catch me, as Farmer Brown's boy does Billy Mink, because of his fine coat. And no one wants to put me in a cage because of a fine voice. I'm satisfied to be just as I am, and if you'll take my advice, Danny Meadow Mouse, you'll be satisfied to be just as you are." "Perhaps you are right," said Danny Meadow Mouse. After a little, "I'll try." Chapter 3. Danny Meadow Mouse plays hide and seek. Life is always a game of hide and seek to Danny Meadow Mouse. You see, he's such a fat little fellow that there are a great many other furry-coated people and almost as many who wear feathers who would gobble Danny up for breakfast or for dinner if they could. Some of them pretend to be his friends, but Danny always keeps his eyes open when they're around and always begins to play hide and seek. Peter Rabbit and Jimmy Skunk and Striped Chipmunk and Happy Jack Squirrel are all friends whom he can trust. But he always has a bright twinkling eye open for Reddy Fox and Billy Mink and Shadow the Weasel and Old Whitetail, the Marsh Hawk, and several more, especially Hooty the Owl at night. Now Danny Meadow Mouse is a stout-hearted little fellow, and when rough Brother North Wind came shouting across the green meadows, tearing to pieces the snow clouds and shaking out the snowflakes until they covered the green meadows deep, 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 Danny just snuggled down in his warm coat in his snug little house of grass and waited. Danny liked the snow. Yes, sir, Danny Meadow Mouse liked the snow. He just loved to dig in it and make tunnels. Through those tunnels in every direction, he could go where he pleased and when he pleased without being seen by anybody. It was great fun. Every little way he made a little round doorway up beside the stiff stalk of grass. Out of this he could peep at the white world and he could get the fresh cold air. Sometimes, when he was quite sure that no one was around, he would scamper across on the top of the snow from one doorway to another, and when he did this, he made the prettiest little footprints. Now, Reddy Fox knew all about those doorways and who made them. Reddy was having hard work to get enough to eat this cold weather, and he was hungry most of the time. One morning, as he was tiptoeing softly over the meadows, what should he see just ahead of him but the head of Danny Meadow Mouse pop out of one of those little round doorways. Reddy's mouth watered, and he stole forward more softly than ever. When he got just within jumping distance, he drew his stout hind legs under him and made ready to spring. Presto! Danny Meadow Mouse had disappeared. Reddy Fox jumped just the same and began to dig as fast as he could make his paws go. He could smell Danny Meadow Mouse, and that made him almost frantic. All the time, Danny Meadow Mouse was scurrying along one of his little tunnels, and when finally Reddy Fox stopped digging because he was quite out of breath, Danny popped his head out of another little doorway and laughed at Reddy. Of course Reddy saw him, and of course Reddy tried to catch him there and dug frantically just as before, and of course Danny Meadow Mouse wasn't there. After a while, Reddy Fox grew tired of this kind of a game and tried another plan. The next time he saw Danny Meadow Mouse stick his head out, Reddy pretended not to see him. He stretched himself out on the ground and made believe that he was very tired and sleepy. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them just the tiniest bit so that he could see Danny Meadow Mouse and yet seem to be asleep. Danny watched him for a long time. Then he chuckled to himself and dropped out of sight. No sooner was he gone than Reddy Fox stole over close to the little doorway and waited. He'll surely stick his head out again to see if I'm asleep, and then I'll have him, said Reddy to himself. So he waited and waited and waited. By and by, he turned his head. There was Danny Meadow Mouse at another little doorway, laughing at him. Chapter 4. Old Granny Fox Tries for Danny Meadow Mouse. Danny had not enjoyed anything so much for a long time as he did that game of hide and seek. He tickled and chuckled all the afternoon as he thought about it. Of course, Reddy had been it. He had been it all the time, for never once had he caught Danny Meadow Mouse. If he had, well, there wouldn't have been any more stories about Danny, because there wouldn't have been any Danny Meadow Mouse anymore. But Danny never let himself think about this. He had enjoyed the game all the more because it had been such a dangerous game. It had been such fun to dive into one of his little round doorways in the snow, run along one of his own little tunnels, and then peep out just another doorway and watch Reddy Fox digging as fast as he ever could at the doorway Danny had just left. Finally, Reddy had given up in disgust and gone off, muttering angrily to find out something else for dinner. Danny had sat up on the snow and watched him go. In his funny little squeaky voice, Danny shouted, "Though Reddy Fox is smart and sly, hi hum diddle do dee do. I'm just as smart and twice as spry, hi hum diddle dee dee do." That night, Reddy Fox told old Granny Fox all about how he had tried to catch Danny Meadow Mouse. Granny listened with her head cocked on one side. When Reddy had told how fat Danny was, her mouth watered. You see, now that snow covered the green meadows and the green forest, and Granny and Reddy had hard work to get enough to eat, and they were hungry most of the time. "I'll go with you down on the meadows tomorrow morning, and then we'll see if Danny is as smart as he thinks he is," said Granny. So bright and early next morning, old Granny Fox and Reddy Fox went down on the meadows where Danny lives. Danny had felt in his bones that Reddy would come back, so he was watching, and he saw them as soon as they came out of the green forest. When he saw old Granny Fox, Danny's heart beat a little faster than before, for he knew that Granny Fox is very smart and very wise. "This is going to be a more exciting game than the other," said Danny to himself, and scurried out of sight to see if all his little tunnels were clear so that he could run fast through them if he had to. Then he peeped out of one of his little doorways hidden in a clump of tall grass. Old Granny set ready to hunting for Danny's little round doorways. Granny came up and sniffed at each. She knew she could tell by the smell which one he had been at last. Danny heard Granny Fox sniff at the doorway he had just left. Suddenly, something plunged down through the snow right at his very heels. Danny didn't have to look to know that it was Granny Fox herself, and he squeaked with fright. Chapter 4. What Happened on the Green Meadows. Thick and fast things were happening to Danny down on the snow-covered green meadows. Rather, they were almost happening. He hadn't minded when Reddy was all alone trying to catch him. Indeed, he had made a regular game of hide and seek of it and had enjoyed it immensely, but now it was different. Granny wasn't so easily fooled as Reddy. Just Granny alone would have made this game dangerous for Danny Meadow Mouse. But Reddy was with her, and so Danny had two to look out for, and he got so many frights that it seemed to him that as if his heart had moved right up to his mouth and was going to stay there. Yes, sir, this is just how it seemed. Down in his little tunnels underneath the snow, Danny felt perfectly safe from Reddy Fox. But old Granny knew all about those little tunnels, and she didn't waste any time digging. Instead, she cocked her sharp little ears and listened with all her might. Now, Granny had very keen ears, oh, very keen ears, and she heard just what she hoped she would hear. She heard Danny running along one of his little tunnels under the snow. Plunge! Old Granny Fox dived right into the snow and right through into the tunnel where Danny was. Her two black paws actually touched Danny's tail. He was glad then that it was no longer. "Ha!" cried Granny. "I almost got him that time." Then she ran ahead a little way over the snow, listening as before. Plunge into the snow she went again. It was lucky for him that Danny had just turned into another tunnel, for otherwise she would have surely caught him. Granny blew the snow out of her nose. "Next time I'll get him," said she. Now, Reddy Fox is quick to learn, especially when it is a way to get something to eat. He watched Granny, and when he understood what she was doing, he made up his mind to have a little try himself, for he was afraid that if she caught Danny, she would think that he was not big enough to divide. Perhaps that was because Reddy was very selfish himself. So the next time Granny plunged into the snow and missed Danny, just as before, Reddy rushed in ahead of her, and the minute he heard Danny running down below, he plunged in just as he had seen Granny do. But he didn't take the pain to make sure of just where Danny was, and so of course he didn't come anywhere near him. But he frightened Danny still more. Poor Danny, he had never been so frightened all his life. He didn't know which way to turn and where to run, so he sat still, which, although he didn't know, was the very best thing he could do. When he sat still, he made no noise, and so of course Granny and Reddy could not tell where he was. Old Granny sat and listened and listened and listened and wondered where Danny was. And down under the snow, Danny sat and listened and listened and listened and wondered where Granny and Reddy were. Chapter 6. Danny Meadow Mouse remembers, Reddy Fox forgets. "There he goes," cried old Granny. "Don't let him sit still again. As long as we keep him running, we can hear him. And one of these times we'll catch him. Pretty soon he'll get too tired to be so spry." Granny licked her chops and smacked her lips. Reddy licked his chops and smacked his lips. Then once more they took turns diving into the snow. And down underneath in the little tunnels, Danny was running for his life. He was getting tired, just as old Granny had said he would. He was almost out of breath. He was sore and one leg smarted, for in one of her jumps old Granny had so nearly caught him that her claws had torn his pants and crushed him. Oh dear, if only I had time to think," panted Danny. And then he squealed in still greater fright as Reddy crashed down into his tunnel right at his very heels. I've got to get somewhere where they can't get at me," he sobbed. And right then, very instant, he remembered the old fence post. The old fence post lay on the ground and was hollow. Fastened to it were long wires and sharp, cruel barbs. Danny had made a tunnel over to that old fence post the very first day after snow came. For in that hollow in the old post he had a secret store of seeds. Why hadn't he thought of it before? It must have been because he was too frightened to think. But he remembered now and dodged into the tunnel that led to the old fence post, running faster than ever. For though his heart was in his mouth from fear, in his heart was hope, and hope is a wonderful thing. Now old Granny knew all about the fence post, and she remembered all about those barbed wires fastened to it. Although they were covered with snow, she knew just about where they lay, and just before she reached them, she stopped plunging down into the snow. Reddy Fox knew about those wires too, but he was so excited that he forgot all about them. "Stop!" cried Granny sharply. But Reddy didn't hear, or if he heard, he didn't heed. His sharp ears could hear Danny running almost underneath him. Granny could stop if she wanted to, but he was going to have Danny for his breakfast. Down into the snow he plunged as hard as he ever could. Oh, wow, oh dear. That wasn't the voice of Danny Meadow Mouse. Oh my no, it was the voice of Reddy. Yes, sir, the voice of Reddy Fox. He had landed with one of his black paws right on one of those sharp wire barbs, and it did hurt dreadfully. "I never did know a young fox could get into so much trouble as you can," snapped Granny, as Reddy hobbled along on three legs. "It serves you right for forgetting." And safe in the hollow of the old fence post, Danny was dressing the scratch on his leg made by the claws of old Granny Fox. Chapter 7. Old Granny Fox tries a new plan. Old Granny Fox kept thinking about Danny. He knew that he was fat and it made her mouth water every time she thought of him. She made up her mind that she must and would have him. She knew that Danny had been very much frightened when she and Reddy had tried so hard to catch him by plunging down through the snow into the little tunnels. She felt pretty sure that he wouldn't go very far away from the old fence post in the hollow of which he was snug and safe. Old Granny was very smart. Danny won't put his nose out of that fence post for a day or two. Then he'll get tired of staying inside all the time and he'll peep out of one of his little round doorways to see if the way is clear. If he doesn't see any danger, he'll come out and run around on the top of the snow to get some of the seeds and in the tops of all the tall grasses that stick out through the snow. If nothing frightens him, he'll keep going a little farther from the fence post every day. I must see to it that Danny isn't frightened for a few days. So said old Granny to herself as she lay under a hemlock tree, studying how she could best get the next meal.